Sup guys? In this video, I want to share my thoughts and opinions on the good and bad aspects of character gameplay designs in Azur Lane. These are just my opinions, so you're free to agree or disagree as you please. Some may accuse me of being biased, but objectively speaking, I do have the best opinions. I'm high-key hoping that the person at Manju designing character kits will randomly stumble across this video, but at the minimum, I hope that you'll find the video interesting. First of all, I'm going to be talking about character loadouts and skills, not their artistic designs or gameplay mechanics such as game modes or systems. Good designs will generally be effects that make logical sense, are pleasant to use, and loadouts that are efficient. I will provide ample examples for each and examples that are on the opposite end of the spectrum as well. Okay, starting off with something basic. I want to highlight some good and bad carrier loadouts. Carriers have slot efficiencies that are independent of each other, and each slot also has their own number of planes. An average loadout looks something like Enterprise, who has 2 slots with 3 planes and one with 2, and 125% efficiencies across the board. It's pretty vanilla and inoffensive. If some of her torpedo bomber efficiencies was taken and given to her fighter and dive bomber slots, it would become more efficient as those slots have more planes, which result in bigger returns in performance from the efficiency. The Essex class does exactly this, and in my opinion is a step up from Enterprise's loadout, taking some of the efficiency from the torpedo bomber slot, which only has 2 planes, and adding more to the other 2 slots with more planes. It's more efficient and makes sense. Other examples of efficient loadouts are Hiryu and Soryu retrofits, and to an even greater extent, Arc Royal, Shokaku, and Illustrious. These carriers have their highest efficiencies in the slots with the most amount of planes, making them incredibly efficient. Let's compare the loadouts of Illustrious to Idol Illustrious. At the time Idol Illustrious was released, rocket fighters were not yet available, so fighters were the weakest plane type when it came to damage. Since they were looking to make Idol Illustrious a more offensive version compared to the base version, they shifted some of the efficiency from the so-called weaker fighters to the torpedo bomber slot, but the number of planes in each slot stayed the same. Let's pretend for a second that fighters and torpedo bombers are equal in value. If you just add up the efficiencies without accounting for the number of planes in each slot, Illustrious has a total of 380% efficiency, while Idol Illustrious has a total of 385%. However, with the number of planes in each slot taken into account, Base Illustrious has a total efficiency of 1030%, overtaking the Idol version, who has a total efficiency of 1020%. So, you can see that even though they have the same plane distribution and on the surface Idol Illustrious has more efficiency, her loadout is actually less efficient and weaker due to her strongest slots having fewer planes. Okay, snapping back to reality, fighter slots are better in more cases these days than torpedo bomber slots, with the introduction of the LA9, H4, and Flapjack. So Illustrious's loadout is much better than Idol Illustrious's. Now let's take a look at some loadouts that don't make any sense at all, and eliciting anywhere from just a squinting of my eyes to full-on cringe. First, let's start with a minor example. Zuikaku is quite an old ship, so it can be forgiven. Unlike her sister, who has by far the highest efficiency on her slot with the most planes, Zuikaku instead has the highest efficiency in her slot with the lowest amount of planes. Thankfully, the difference is very minor, so it doesn't annoy me all that much. Getting to some slightly more annoying examples, we've got both of the carriers from PR4, Haku and AVP. Haku is extremely powerful, so nobody really notices, but her first slot has more planes but lower efficiency than her second slot. Again, just like Zuikaku, the difference is minor, so it's not a huge deal, but if the efficiencies were reversed, it would do a lot of good for my mental health. Yes, this is all I think about on a day-to-day basis. Now, AVP. She's got 140% efficiency on her fighters, which can be further increased to 150% from her yellow skill, but she only has 2 fighters while having 3 dive bombers with only 110% efficiency. Let's pretend that the 2 slots are equal in value again, and see what would happen if we flip the number of planes from 2 fighters and 3 dive bombers to 3 fighters and 2 dive bombers. We would get a whopping 3.8% increase in total damage. Okay, it's honestly a little bit less than I thought, but fighters are worth more than dive bombers, especially for AVP, who can set up her rocket fighters perfectly while dive bombers do not benefit nearly as much, relatively speaking. So it's bad design in my opinion to give significantly higher efficiencies to plane slots that have fewer planes, and lower efficiencies to slots with more planes. And I think the developers are also aware of this, as I can't think of any recent examples where they messed it up. For example, Joffre, Painlevé, Volga, Theseus, and all the rainbow carriers after Haku do not have any slots with higher efficiency but fewer planes compared to another. Okay, moving on to the next thing that I want to talk about. The Destroyer Max Limit Break perks. If you don't know what I'm talking about, all destroyers get one of 3 bonuses when they're limit broken. The first bonus increases the stats of their auxiliary equipment by 30%. This bonus only applies to stat increases and not skills. The second bonus reduces the number of main gunshots required to trigger their all-out assaults by 50%. The third bonus reduces the spread of their torpedoes. All 3 bonuses have their uses and situations where they are the best, but anytime the destroyer has a powerful all-out assault, they'll almost certainly benefit the most from firing more all-out assaults. While most destroyers of the same class share the same perks, the Summoner class breaks out of the mold in a creative way that makes sense. Alan M. Sumner herself is a damage-focused destroyer with mostly damage buffs, a timed barrage, and a powerful all-out assault. As a result, she gets the all-out assault perk. Then, Ingraham came out with a clearly more support-oriented kid, having higher anti-air efficiency, some healing, and an anti-air buff that scales off her torpedo stat, including the stats of her equipment. Unlike Sumner, she received the bonus auxiliary stats perk, which helps her with her survivability and gives her more stat bonuses from Oxytorps, which can be converted into more anti-air. But for some reason, they never did anything like this ever again. Laffy too, similar to Ingraham, would have benefited greatly from auxiliary stats, but instead she was given the all-out assault perk. Most people probably aren't aware, but Laffy 2's all-out assault is weaker than Ingraham's. Keep in mind that I'm not saying the auxiliary bonus would make Laffy 2 better than having the all-out assault perk, but rather it would make more sense and probably be equally as good, as Laffy is not a damage-oriented ship but a tank packed with all the utility you would ever want from a destroyer. The biggest letdown for me though was the J class, as Janus is one of my most favorite ships, so it's a bit personal for me. Before Janus, previous J-class destroyers all had the bonus Aug Stats perk, which was fine because they didn't deal much damage anyway. Jervis in particular was able to make good use of it, being a tank who also had very high anti-submarine capability, and would benefit greatly from bonus HP and anti-submarine stats from her auxiliaries. However, Janus is a much different type of ship, and is almost entirely damage-oriented outside of a tiny shield. Unlike Jervis, she's not particularly tanky at all either. She would benefit much more from the all-out assault perk, but instead she got stuck with the auxiliary perk. Looking at her all-out assault, Janus's is one of the most powerful in the game, easily outdamaging that of Laffy 2's, and pretty much all gun-focused destroyers, including LMM Sumner. However, many destroyers with significantly weaker all-out assaults, such as again Laffy 2, and all of the Akizuki class destroyers, all get the all-out assault perk over her. I doubt that this is something that can be changed, but I really do hope they pay attention and just think about it for more than 1 second in the future when handing out these max limit break perks. The next thing I want to talk about is chance-based skill effects. In the early days of the game, 60% to 70% chance to activate skills were quite common and considered good relative to what was available. I won't retroactively speak badly about those times, but there's no reason to be doing these types of skills in current times. These days, there are so many options to choose from if you want a barrage or a buff that isn't tied to RNG. Back in the day, at least there were some chance-based skills that were abnormally strong when they did proc, such as Helena's SG Radar, Enterprise's Lucky E, and Nagato's Sakura 7 for its time. Recently, however, skills that can fail to activate are not significantly stronger than skills that are guaranteed. Let's take a look at some barrages. Chance-based barrages like the ones on Rupee, Alvitor, Lutso, West Virginia Retrofit, and Colorado Retrofit are no stronger than guaranteed ones like Hood, Queen Elizabeth Meta, Oori, Brunhilde, and so on. Not to mention every single Rainbow battleship, who all have guaranteed barrages way stronger than the SSR ones I mentioned. Barrages are very often a significant part of a battleship's damage output. Even if ships with non-guaranteed barrages can compensate for the lower chance to activate from other effects, such as stronger self-buffs or some kind of support, the biggest issue is that said barrage can fail to activate multiple times in a row, which leads to the ship not being able to meet the expectation you should have for them. Since there is almost no cost to resetting fights in campaign, or Operation Siren for that matter, if you really like a ship with a non-guaranteed barrage like Monarch or Richelieu, you can just reset until they proc their barrages every time, in which case their performance is actually quite good. Ultimately, the penalty they have for having chance-based barrages is that it inconveniences the player and makes them unreliable for full auto clears. Here's the catch. There are actually some pretty good ideas and fixes that have already been implemented in-game, but for some reason their implementations are extremely inconsistent. I'll highlight 3 examples of such fixes. First is Roma's barrage skill. Her barrage is quite single target focused, as you can see from this clip here. It adds roughly 30% damage on top of her main gun damage when it activates. If it fails, she instead gains 20% bonus on her shelling, which serves almost an identical role as the barrage, which would already be good enough, but it also has a slow attached to it as well. The slow isn't super useful because it's not something you can rely on, but it at least increases the hit rate of her own shelling, further closing the gap between a successful barrage activation and a failed one. Sadly, Roma isn't particularly strong because her numbers aren't too impressive. In particular, her accuracy and main gun efficiency are quite low, but the idea behind the barrage skill makes a lot of sense. The next example are barrages like Brunhilde's and Nelson retrofits. While their activation is not straight up guaranteed, if they meet their conditions, which in these cases are quite realistic, they can guarantee their barrage procs. The final example are Hood and Izumo, where they just got their barrages completely fixed by their augments. I don't think I can locate a single Hood or Izumo fan who has anything bad to say about their augments. There are also some effects that are not quite as good, such as Marco Polo's and Belarusia's. For Marco Polo, the secondary effect is simply too weak to the point where it does nothing. Think about it. 5% heal 15% of the time when she whiffs her barrage is not going to make a difference whatsoever. Even if that heal was, let's say, 5% for the entire fleet, which sounds like it would be a lot, you would have to keep in mind that it only procs on 15% of her salvos. This would equate to 0.75% heal for the fleet on average per salvo, which is really nothing, but when it does proc, you don't feel as bad about missing her barrage. It could honestly be 10% for the entire fleet, and it would still be balanced due to only having a 15% chance to proc. Just leave it at 1% at skill level 1 so that people don't purposely leave her skill unleveled to turn her into a shitty healer. Even with 10% heal for the entire fleet every time her barrage fails to proc, she would still be quite significantly weaker than all of the Rainbow battleships. For Belarusia, getting a 50% AA buff isn't going to make a difference in 99% of cases, and I think it could be a lot better if that buff was reload instead. Keep in mind that a 50% increase in reload stat is not equal to 50% reduction in cooldown. So far, I've only talked about battleship barrages, but I feel the same way about Vanguard barrages. Because they're some of my favorite ships design-wise, it always rubbed me the wrong way that LMM Sumner and Janus's timed barrages are chance-based. While they're nowhere near as impactful as battleship barrages when they fail to proc, there is just no reason for them to be chance-based, while ships like most of the more recent Akizuki class, Otto, Felix, and the such have guaranteed barrages, as the chance-based ones are not much higher in DPS to warrant the inconsistency. To find a very interesting way to make a chance-based barrage for a Vanguard ship, look no further than Attilio Rigolo. She has a 50-50 chance to fire either a White Rabbit or a Black Rabbit, one scaling off firepower while the other scaling off torpedo stat, and the numbers were balanced so that neither one would deal significantly more damage than the other, given the difference in her firepower and torpedo stats. Now that is just brilliant. There are also chance-based buff activations such as full firepower, quick reload, many of the starters' buffs, and very famously Helena's S3 radar. I'm pretty sure literally no one likes them, and fortunately we're seeing less and less of them these days. Okay, since I already brought up some augments, I'm going to talk about those next. They have made some amazing unique augments that have breathed a second life into their ships, including Hood, Izumo, Kawakaze, Shangri-La, San Diego, and to a lesser extent Saratoga, Taiho, and Z47. I'm sure there are a couple others that I'm missing. But why is it that some of the other augments are so lazy and uninspired? For example, let's look at Littorio's. Her barrage wasn't even better than Hood's to begin with, and while Hood got her barrage rate increased to 100%, and the light damage doubled, Littorio only had her gun restriction removed, something which she never played into since release anyway. The result is that her two weaknesses, the overall lack of damage and inconsistency, are completely unaddressed. Unfortunately, it gets even worse than that. Let's take a look at John Barr's augment. Due to being locked to the quadruple 380, her damage is extremely inconsistent and falls off a cliff against any enemy that doesn't have light armor. Now, what does her augment do to address these two weaknesses? Absolutely nothing. It just adds a simple and weak, generic-looking barrage, which increases her overall damage output slightly, but she suffers from the exact same problems as before, while gaining nothing new in terms of strengths. The final example of a badly designed augment is King George V's. Before her unique augment, she had decent buffs, but required your fleet to have 4 total Royal Navy ships, and her to use the quadruple 356 in order to activate them all. The 356 was simply too weak, even with the skill, so it was largely ignored. Her barrage, even the enhanced version, was also quite weak. With her unique augment, she has 2 options. 1, sortie with at least 1 other Royal Navy ship, in which case she gets access to her flat stat buffs, but still needs to use the 356 in order to activate her gun buff and enhanced barrage. So essentially the exact same as before, but instead of 4 Royal Navy ships, it now takes 2. The second option is to sortie with no other Royal Navy ships, in which case she gains her gun buff and enhanced barrage without having to use the quad 356, but then she loses her 20% firepower and reload buff and 10% bonus damage against specific factions, which is not a worthwhile trade-off, given how weak she is without these buffs. To sum it all up, even with her augment, she cannot gain access to all of her buffs without using the quad 356. Her relatively weak barrage gained no upgrade whatsoever, and it's still also a chance-based activation. As far as unique augments for SSR ships go, this is probably one of the most underwhelming on an already subpar ship, no less. Aside from poorly designed augments, there are some lazy ones too. By lazy, I'm referring to augments that simply increase damage by a flat amount. Some examples include Centaur, Z23, and Belfast's unique augments. Starting with Centaur, she got 10% plane efficiencies and 10% damage if sortied with 2 other Royal Navy ships. It actually ends up being quite decent because it gives reload in its stats, which is a very rare and desirable stat for carriers, but nonetheless it is very plain. For Centaur though, her biggest weakness is her lack of damage by modern standards, so it's still honestly acceptable for me that she only got a flat damage buff, but I feel like it's still a bit lacking to get her up to par with some of the other modern SSR carriers. For Z23, literally all she gained was 10% main gun efficiency, 8% damage reduction, and some extra HP from the augment itself. Since she already had 175% main gun efficiency to begin with, this is only a 5.7% increase to her gun damage, and 0% increase to her torpedo or barrage damage. The damage reduction and HP gives her about 15% extra EHP. These changes do a grand total of nothing in making her more easy or fun to use. Her buffs are extremely inconsistent and insist on using faster guns to have better uptime, while her gun-focused loadout favors damage-oriented guns. Even with the extra bulk, she's not particularly tanky. Since she's one of the rare destroyers who can equip a light cruiser gun, perhaps she could have instead received a buff when using a light cruiser gun, one that actually makes it worthwhile to bring one, much like Otto and Felix. For instance, she could gain 30% extra main gun efficiency and a heavily enhanced all-out assault, making her both unique and reasonably strong. Lastly, I believe Belfast's unique augment was one of the very first, so I'll give it a slight pass for being what it is, but it's just the same as Z23's, giving flat damage bonus and some EHP via an evasion buff, but even worse as it's conditioned on there being a burning enemy. This slight buff does nothing in the way of making her compete with the other modern SSR light cruisers. So here are my ideas on how these augments could be improved, although it will never happen. For Littorio, her Barrage should just simply be 100% chance. There's no excuse, and the only thing being 75% chance does is make the user frustrated. That's already a significant upgrade, but I do think that her accuracy is a bit too low, so I would propose that she gains a 20% accuracy buff as well. She still won't be one of the best SSR battleships when you put her next to someone like Izumo, but she would be extremely solid and reliable. For Jean Bart, I would just remove her gun lock, or at least make it all French guns, so that she can gain access to equipment like the Champagne gun. For King George, she should get both her buffs if sortied with Royal Navy ships, and her Barrage should be at least upgraded to 100% because it is neither spammable at a fixed 24-second interval, nor particularly strong. I've already discussed a potential change for Z23's augment, so I'll skip over it. For Belfast, I will change her evasion buff to evasion rate, and make her bonus damage against burning enemies apply to your entire vanguard. 16% damage to the entire vanguard would be decent, but not overboard, considering it hinges on there being a burning enemy. It's also still much weaker than Aurora's buff, but Belfast could be a much tankier alternative with the evasion rate buff. One last thing I want to mention when it comes to augments is that these ships like Jean Bart, Littorio, Z23, and Belfast are not unpopular. In fact, quite the opposite. There is absolutely an argument to be made that Jean Bart, Littorio, and Belfast are the most iconic ships of their respective factions, and some of the most popular ships overall. There is no loss in making them at least competitive with the more modern SSR ships. Unfortunately, the devs haven't shown that they are willing to consider changing unique augments up until this point, so I'm not expecting anything, but I do hope that they will take the time to make sure the unique augments feel impactful from now on, rather than to push them out lazily and without any standards, just to meet a quota, as they can make a huge positive impact when done well. Okay, moving on. This next thing is something that is actually typically done quite well, and that is buffs, which are more restrictive, being stronger than ones that are more broad. There are quite a lot of good examples of these. We can look at the Anshan class of guided missile destroyers. Anshan's buff is extremely powerful as it's restricted to only other Anshan class ships, while Changchun's is weaker, but it affects all Dragon Emperor and Northern Parliament ships, including the likes of Soyuz and Kronstadt. We can also look to, for example, Dido's buff, which only affects Dido class ships but gives a significant boost to 3 extremely relevant stats to the ships of that class, compared to Emden, who only gives a 10% firepower buff, but affects all Iron Blast ships, including the main fleet ones. And then there's Marseillaise, who buffs all French ships, including main fleet ships, just like Emden. But since there are fewer French ships than Iron Blast ships, she buffs more than just firepower, but the buff is a lower percent because it buffs multiple stats. One last good example of this is Aurora's evasion rate debuff, which only affects destroyers and light cruisers, compared to Swiftshires and Bristols, which affect all armor types but are weaker and much less consistent. Aurora's Vanguard buff is extremely strong, and it is broad, but it is balanced around the fact that she is literally only worth that buff and does little to nothing else. And now it's time for some bad examples. The first example is Yorktown 2. Now don't get me wrong, she's an amazing ship, but her buff to Essex and Yorktown class carriers should really be stronger given how restrictive it is compared to other ships with more lax restrictions, such as Shinano, Kearsarge, and Soyuz. In my opinion, her buffs should either apply to all USS carriers so that she can be used with the likes of Saratoga and Independence, and other potential future retrofits or new classes like the Midway class carriers, or it should be slightly stronger in value because of its restrictiveness. The second example is Janus. You may be thinking out this entire video is just motivated by a desire to get Janus buffed, and you would be 100% correct in thinking that. Her buff only applies to J-class destroyers and has a value of 10%. There are plenty of buffs with similar numbers that either apply to way more ships or have much higher numbers. Look no further than her sister ship, Jervis, who has almost the same buffs but to all HMS destroyers, and it doesn't take a genius to predict that there are and will be more HMS destroyers than just J-class ones. Other examples include Anshan, Z1, and Dido, who all, just like Janus, only buff ships in their own class, but the numbers are, in many cases, much higher, or Leipzig, whose buff is similar in value, but much less restrictive. The next thing I want to talk about are ships with a bunch of effects that do a whole bunch of nothing, and ships with good effects, but are completely hampered by their base stats. Let's think of some skill effects that are always useful. Some that instantly come to my mind are heals, barrages, and extra guns. Let's give a ship a 1% heal per fight to the lowest HP ship in the fleet, and fires a barrage that deals 1000 damage once per battle. Now we make them the tankiest ship in the game, and give them decent damage by virtue of stats alone. Amazing, right? That's kind of what we have in the case of Napoli and Prince Rupee. Napoli's loadout is kind of unique because she has one heavy cruiser main gun mount and 2 light cruiser secondary gun mounts. She also gains a special auxiliary gun from her first skill, but its damage is pathetic. Past that, she just has skills which directly increases her damage and EHP, and her all-out assault takes 50 seconds to trigger once without dealing insane damage to compensate for the cooldown. She's still a great ship due to her insanely high stats and stat buffs, but her skills are very poorly designed in my opinion. For Prince Rupee, she has a chance-based barrage, which isn't even strong, and instead of guaranteeing the proc rate, her fate simulation gave her a heal so weak it might as well not exist. She's still a decent ship by virtue of her stats and special auxiliary gun, but she could have really benefited from a reliable barrage that made good use of the flagship position and a more impactful heal to set her apart from Odin. On the other end of the spectrum are ships that actually have pretty good skills, but no base stats to back them up. I don't really mind because it usually happens with purple ships, and it's a nice surprise, although I wish they could make more gold ships with both good skills and good stats. The best example is Longwu, whose skills straight up give her double torpedoes, 30% damage reduction, which is a huge increase in EHP, targeted healing, which totals up to 9% for the lowest HP ship in the fleet every fight, so it is always useful, and all her barrages scale off her torpedo stat, which is much higher than her firepower stat. There is quite literally nothing bad you can pick out from her skills in terms of both effects or numbers, but unfortunately, her stats are so lacking that she's still just a mediocre ship with everything taken into account. On any destroyer with respectable stats, like at least 2.2k HP and 400 torpedo stat, this kit would be pretty insane. There does tend to be retrofits for Dragon Emperor ships every Chinese New Year though, so I do have hope that she will get something later down the line. The final topic I want to discuss are defensive buffs. Defensive buffs I really like are Anchorage's Smokescreen and Jervis's Evasion Rate buff. Anchorage's Smokescreen is tied to her torpedo launch, so the player can adjust its cooldown to line up with the enemy's big attack, which is very valuable. Jervis's Evasion Rate buff has a chance to activate when she takes damage, so if there's not much damage flying at her, she is unlikely to randomly proc her buff and waste its uptime. Pomiat, Mercuria, and Eldritch have defensive skills similar to Jervis's, but theirs start on a 20-second cooldown, which severely cripples their effectiveness, as there are quite a lot of situations where a lot of damage is being received within those first 20 seconds. Defensive buffs that I find to not be as effective are timed buffs, because they can just go to waste if the enemy isn't doing anything when they go off. This applies to most smokescreens that activate at a fixed time interval, Jeanne d'Arc's shield and Talon's shield. Okay, for the rest of the video, I'm just going to list off some things that I like and dislike, but don't fit into any broad category. Munition ships being worse buffers is just kind of sad. Give them the aviation cargo and they turn into a significantly worse version of Sirius. They can't even equip multiple cargoes at once. They should be able to carry extra ammo since they're literally called munition ships, and perhaps other useful and special mechanics such as heal packs and preemptive strikes. Yes, this would make them similar to a Vanguard version of repair ships, but that's the problem with repair ships. Why don't they heal a little bit more instead? Charybdis and Peter Strasser are a couple of unique ships whose skill effects ended up being not very impactful. For what a better version of Charybdis could look like, look at Bismarck Sway's Black Hole. As for Peter Strasser, I proposed making her route last 3 whole seconds, but reduce the activation chance to compensate. That way, when it does randomly proc, it feels a lot more impactful. Some timed buffs are too short in duration. Formidable's route is a good example where it was quite difficult to guarantee your airstrikes could land, despite it being a complete freeze due to its duration. The devs noticed and eventually made better versions of it with AVP and Implacable. Vanguard's on-reload buff also feels a bit too short at 6 seconds, especially because she excels in triple battleship comps. Not only is she naturally just significantly faster than the other battleships, but battleships take over 3 seconds to deliver all their damage, and there's also absolute cooldown to account for. Duke of York's debuff lasts 8 seconds, and Alsace's lasts 10 seconds, if not for the entire battle, both of which feel much better to use. Soyuz's also lasts 6 seconds, but her reload is much more in line with other battleships. Vanguard's should at least last 8 seconds, in my opinion. UVH feels much different than all the other battleships, which are mostly different flavors of strong barrages on fire, on top of very high stats in EHP, and even though her raw damage output isn't the greatest, it makes her a lot more interesting to use and gives her niche uses, which will likely continue to shine, even as other UR battleships like New Jersey start to get power crept by newer ships, despite being stronger than UVH on release. Since we get so many UR battleships, I hope we can see more unique ones like UVH. Mogador's debuff should be for firepower damage. She herself almost entirely deals firepower-based damage, and there are no good torpedo ships among the French ships. Nobody is going to use her in a torpedo-based setup, and rarely in torpedo bomber-focused carrier setups, which are usually used against heavy armor. It doesn't make sense at all for her to have torpedo damage increase. Finally, Dyson's kit is very lacking in focus. Her barrage is single target focused, but she also has some heals indicating that she would be good in a mob fleet. I hope that future ships that are important, like PR ships, have more deliberation put into designing skills that complement their identity. And that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed the ramblings of a madman. Manju, if you ever need ideas, you can always hit up your boy. I got all the solutions. Alright, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.